Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. In today's video, my guest is Dr. Jensine Andresen. To introduce her, so basically she's a multidisciplinary scholar with an extensive academic background. In fact, she has a bachelor's in civil engineering from the Princeton University, master's in social anthropology from Columbia, and a PhD in philosophy and religion from Harvard. And she has held various positions in academia, business, finance, and government. And she writes about the academic and societal implications of extraterrestrial intelligence. She's also a strong advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the demilitarization of space. And she has also translated several Indo-Tibetan Sanskrit texts. And so her expertise ranges from philosophy and religion to science and public policy. And of course, she's the author of numerous books and articles. And I'm gonna just link the page below so you can see the extensive list of what she's written. But I'm just gonna mention briefly Extraterrestrial Ethics, which is basically like a collection of essays of which she's also an author as well as an editor, I believe. And Hyperconvergence, Religion, Politics, and UFOs. And then Hyperconflation, recommending a relational alternative to the data-centric approach to UAP. So, Dr. Jensine, thank you so much for joining. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and thank you so much for the invitation. I was really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine. And it's not often that you come across somebody who's like a perfect polymath, who's interested in has such vast experience in such diverse fields. So I'm sure you'll be able to sort of bring to bear the weight of your insights on so many different topics that we're going to talk about. And the first thing that caught my attention from the podcast that I watched of yours on YouTube is what you say in extraterrestrial ethics. And so maybe that's a good point to start off the conversation with. Extraterrestrial ethics, where you talk about, where you take this unique approach to the idea of UAPs and the implications for humanity, and this whole idea of creative acculturation. So that's a good point. So because a lot of podcasts on UFOs talk about, speculate on what they are and different theories and speculations, but here we are starting with the assumption that okay, let's say they exist. What is the implication for humanity in terms of society and ethics and so on?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. And I'll backtrack just a little bit to the publication. So I have two publications that are very similarly titled. And one of them is Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And that is rightly stated an edited volume of which I am one of the contributors. So in that volume of 18 chapters, I have the first chapter and the last chapter, which is sort of something you get to do if you're the editor. You get to decide who gets what place in the book. So anyway, and then many other wonderful chapters in that edited volume. Massimo Teodorani, for example, has a great chapter in there, and there's another colleague who's written about Bohm pretty extensively in that book. So that's an edited volume, Extraterrestrial Intelligence. My book, Extraterrestrial Ethics, which, it's very easy to, confuse those two titles. That's a single authored manuscript. So that's a book that I've written myself. And that's the book in which I really start to unpack a couple of things. One is two views of ethics. I'm just turning, oh, there we go. One is two particular theories of ethics. The utilitarian approach versus the deontological approach. And then I use that theoretical framework to help us understand the topic of humanity's acculturation with an extraterrestrial species. And so, there's ethics theory. So I'm going in through the door of what already exists in the human discipline of ethics in terms of this, bifurcation of approaches, the utilitarian approach. And just, briefly stated, what are those? So utilitarianism is the idea that the ends justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as you end up with an ethical outcome, it doesn't really matter how you get there, no matter how immoral the means may be. So that's one approach. And you could say that most of human society, especially in the last, I would say, 20 or 30 years, is really, most of foreign policy, all of these arenas of human discourse and human interaction have been predicated on utilitarianism. And I'm saying there's another way to think about ethical issues. That's the deontological approach. That's where the ends don't justify them. So that is a much steeper moral road or hill to climb, in the sense that everything you do, you have to try to do to the best of your ability in an ethical and moral way, not with the idea of strategizing toward an outcome.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you. So, this makes me wonder, because this is a very unique way of approaching the topic, because the moment people talk about UAPs and UFOs, and I've done this extensively on my channel as well, people look at it from a point of view of national security standpoint and how they can be a threat, and how we have to defend ourselves and so on. But then you talk of something completely different, ethics. So why ethics, and how does that come into play in our thoughts and interactions with probably
Right.
an terrestrial culture?
So what I'm saying is, if you're looking at it through a national security lens, that's already a utilitarian lens. That's already a lens that is completely predicated on the notion of strategy and tactics, right?
Yeah.
That's what foreign policy and you could say defense culture and armament production and weaponization, it's all based around that, isn't it? Or war itself or conflicts of any type. It's based on strategy and tactics. And so I'm saying, let's try engaging with this extraterrestrial culture in a completely different way. Let's try going through the door of a deontological approach, a moral approach, an ethical approach, right? Where the ends don't justify the means, meaning
Right.
I, in my moment, do the best I can. And the cookie crumbles however the cookie crumbles. But I try to do the right thing. So I'm saying, so in psychology, sometimes people talk about the difference of locus of control, an external locus of control or an internal locus of control. So we can map that onto this in the following way. We can say that if you are first all preoccupied, oh, are they a threat? Are they not a threat? If you're in this kind of a mode, the locus of control is external, and then you're in a reactive position, right? Another completely different way to approach it is just simply be in yourself. The locus of control is internal, and do your best with the moment. Doesn't matter really what the other culture is or is not doing. And that same kind of approach is also viable in interpersonal human relations. You just do the best with the moment. You do the best that you can in the moment, yourself, from an internal place, and things are going to go the way they're going to go. Now, so that's an approach, right? It's an ethical approach. It's a moral approach. It's an internal locus of control approach. It's an approach where you retain the autonomy to be the person that you need to be, right? And to develop spiritually, culturally, ethically, however you want to, artistically, creatively yourself, right? And you do your best with every moment. So I'm suggesting that's a positive way to approach this. We can simply do the right thing, which is to be peaceful ourselves, to be kind ourselves, to be warm and welcoming ourselves. Now, of course, the counter argument is going to be, well, you're completely naive. Like how naive can you get, lady, right? And I don't think so, because it really comes down to the question of what is the purpose, really getting into purpose. Like, what is your purpose here? Is your purpose to live another day longer than the quote unquote enemy, or is your purpose to grow yourself and be a good person? And so I don't think it's naive at all from the latter point of view. Now, I don't want to jump all the way over to the other topic right away. That does not mean that I am agnostic on whether the extraterrestrial species that is interacting with us is kind or not. I think it's kind and beneficent and not a
Right.
threat. But even if I didn't think that, I would still argue for this kind of approach.
Right. But in terms of the existing structure of society and the way we live, the way we think, for example, how do you think this kind of an interaction will change us, will affect humanity? Is that also
I,
something that falls under the ambit of approaching it this way, or you just allow the natural consequence to happen
Right.
in a
No.
way?
Okay. So now we can go and look at this topic of acculturation. What
Right.
do I mean by this term acculturation? So firstly, acculturation is reciprocal. So it's very different from, and I was mindful, I was very deliberate in choosing the word acculturation, because I did not want to use the word assimilation, because I don't believe this is an assimilation. An assimilation is where you have a dominant culture who that doesn't really particularly care that much about the non-dominant culture and just assimilates the non-dominant culture into itself, and all vestiges of the non-dominant culture, I'm speaking sort of like as an anthropologist now, sort of cease to exist, or they're completely diluted to the point of you can hardly find them anymore. And we see this all over the world. We
Hmm.
see this assimilation happening all over the world still today, for humankind's our understanding of our historical past. It's replete with examples of assimilation, right? I don't think that's what's going on here. I think we have a much more mutual thing going on, an acculturation process. And one of the pieces of, sort of evidence, if you want to call it evidence, that I would put forth to support that idea is the fact that this is going pretty slowly, really. If you take at face value the very credible descriptions of the high level of technological development that is available to this extraterrestrial species, they could move a lot more quickly if they wanted to. They're showing an inordinate amount of patience, sort of slowing down to, I think, our level, and bringing humankind forward in a way that is not entirely disruptive to our culture. At the
Right.
same time, I think there is reciprocity. So there's been an evolution, I would say, in accounts of how interactions are occurring since, easily from the 1930s to the present, let's say for the past 100 years. And it does seem that the extraterrestrial species is learning too, maybe how to be a bit gentler and how to work more constructively with our culture. So that acculturation process is, I think, mutual. It's slow, it's patient. However, I think that we need to be a bit more deliberate about it from our side, from the human side. And so what I would like to do is sort of move this, our conversation. So I've been thinking about how to articulate this, because it's not something I've published
Yeah.
yet. But it was sort of that extraterrestrial ethics book was the door, opening the door to this conversation. I think we need to learn how to normalize this conversation about the extraterrestrial interaction. And so normalization would mean removing it from being only a conversation that's occurring in the lens or through the lens of national security and government. let's move the conversation. Okay, so there have been two primary ways that the UFO professionals, I'll say, that the people that have taken it upon themselves to professionalize themselves on this topic, and someone might very well turn around, so haven't you done the same thing? You publish books, so maybe I'm guilty too. But it seems that they go in two directions. There's sort of the government, national security. We've been lied to. We need accountability and transparency. We're bringing in Congress, and it's very paradigmatic. And I say that in a negative way, actually. And then the other side of the conversation has been sort of the complete opposite. It's been, I think, too much of a religious interpretation, too much of a conflation of human to extraterrestrial contact with something that is religious or paranormal, which I think ontologically is the incorrect way to view this. Okay, but we've had these two bookends, right? And I'm saying maybe it makes sense now to have a different kind of conversation, and which is, how do we start to discuss this topic at the same time we're discussing important features of geopolitics and geoeconomics? Like, how do we look at this topic alongside, for example, what's going on right here, right now, with respect to nuclear weapons? Or, for example, what just happened in Iran with the bombing, the strikes on the three sites, and the most likely scenario being that the highly enriched uranium is now who knows where, Okay, so how do we take something that's that timely, that urgent, that's important, and merge that conversation with the extraterrestrial conversation? Because I think they're completely linked. I think any highly intelligent extraterrestrial species that's interacting with us now is going to care a whole lot that there might be highly enriched uranium running around who knows where in an unsecured way, right? So how do we start bringing these conversations together?
Yeah. So actually, there are so many points that came up in my mind to ask you. So I noted down three. Just to backtrack, when you speak of acculturation and not assimilation, so one, from my all the study that I've done, all the books that I've read so far over the years, it is my understanding. Of course, there's no way for me to know. There's no proof or anything. It is the generally held belief that it's not just one species of extraterrestrial intelligence that's interacting. There could be many different types, and they could be coming from, I don't know, different dimensions, different time, or different whatever, like different galaxy, who knows what. What if the gap, the width, the gap between our development is so vast, and if they are millions of years ahead of us, or forget, maybe even tens of thousands of years ahead of us, that they're able to come here and interact with us, how does acculturation look in that sense? Because it may be so completely different and alien. How does that work? And two, if they are so advanced, would they even care? It's like between us and like maybe some animal or some ant or something that we acknowledge, but we don't want to interact with them. So is the fact that they are not interacting is because they're benevolent and understanding, they want to take it easy, or they just don't want to have anything to do with warmongering humans yet?
Okay, so a couple of things. So I'll go back to this word, and I find myself needing to apologize for picking a tough word, but it's acculturation. There's no Z in there.
Okay.
Okay, so acculturation. So let's you had a lot of questions in there, and they're all really good, great questions. So let's first take the topic with which you led, which is it one extraterrestrial species or perhaps many of them, and are there? So okay, I argue pretty strongly in my published work that I believe this is I don't believe, how do I put it? I believe, I'm certain this is extraterrestrial. Okay, so I don't think we're talking about something that's quote unquote interdimensional. And if you or the listeners read, I believe it's the book Hyperconvergence, where I really go down into the weeds on that argument, why I don't subscribe to this interdimensionality notion. Part of it is because I don't think that's correct physics. So, and we can get into Bohm a little bit later. So, and I think in this case, we're really not talking about time travelers. I wouldn't say that's impossible, because I certainly, who knows what's possible, but I don't think that's what we're dealing with here. So now, the one or many question, my view is that while theoretically and even practically, there are probably many, many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of different extraterrestrial species that exist in the universe and in the cosmos. Well, I'm sure that's probably true. I think that there is a real signature pattern to the interactions that have occurred with human beings since at least around the 30s. And that signature pattern, who knows if there are a few like little, onlooker species who like are really keeping their distance, but watching this from a distance. But I think in terms of the acculturation process, that has had a signature that has been very consistent since the 30s. So I would say there's one culture that's at least leading it, if not the only one actively engaged. And I'm not, they are actively engaged. So now this comes to your next question. If they are so advanced, why would they care? And I think a lot of the reason that they are involved does have to do with humankind's, crossing of the nuclear threshold and development of nuclear weapons. And you really do see a lot more interaction, starting with when we were just starting to understand the precursor science, let's say in the late 30s, to the actual eventual development of nuclear weapons. And then, now there certainly does seem to be a lot of concern about that. And that, I think, goes to a really deep, so why? Let's say this is a species that, maybe its home planet is far, far away. Like, why do they care if a nuclear bomb goes off on Earth? Isn't that just so far away that it doesn't impact? And now this gets into the issue of ontology. And so, okay, in the UFO conversation, you hear a phrase bandied about, which I think is not quite being used, not at all being used correctly, which is this notion of ontological shock. I think what they mean is not ontological shock. They mean existential shock. And that is very much a sociological and psychological kind of series of considerations. And they are interesting to discuss, but it's not ontological in nature, that discussion. It's existential. So what's going on?
Sorry to interrupt. So what would you say was the difference? Because it's so deeply, ingrained in the public thing that it is ontological shock, that if you were saying it's sociological shock, what is the difference?
Existential.
Existential. Yeah.
It's existential shock, and that has certainly at least three. Well, really, now that I'm thinking about it, existential shock really has at least five main sub-arenas, right? It's sociological, psychological, anthropological, political, and economic at the least. And the idea of what I think they're talking about really is the notion that we have understood ourselves as a human society to be pretty self-contained. And so we've never really had to consider existential issues in terms of, could our entire society cave just from the shock of this? and that would have existential repercussions. People would die, right? Um, markets might collapse, logistical networks might collapse, people would stop. I mean, it could be incredibly disruptive if it all occurs too suddenly, and that has existential ramifications for the species, right? Are we going to make it through such a surprising series of developments, right, if they pick up pace? That's, I think, what people mean, right? But ontology is a different thing. Ontology is very difficult for a lot of people to grasp, in the sense that it is really deep. So there's reality, right? And there's this thing. So I'm going to make a series of distinctions. There is what we perceive reality to be. Now, that's an epiphenomenon. That's a byproduct of our perceptual capacity. So that, we perceive in a certain spectrum visually, because that's the spectrum in which we perceive, but we know that the spectrum beyond the visual, exists, right? Yeah. But we don't routinely perceive that. Dogs have better hearing than humans, right? So there's what we perceive reality to be, and then there's what reality really is. Let's say, if you could perceive it completely, if you had the either inborn or technological means to do so. But then there's this other thing, which is, call it the nature of reality. So It's not what reality is, but the nature of it. And that's ontology. And that's deeply theoretical. And I would argue it can be, for certain people who are open to it, deeply experiential too. The actual nature of reality, apart from reality per se and our perception of it, right? So discussions about the nature of reality, I was really fortunate, let me put it that way. I had an incredibly good education. And Princeton is great. There's no other way to put it. It's just a great university, and it's really great when it gets to physics. And I was immersed in that, and it was so interesting, right? Bohm worked at Princeton for a while. And then obviously, there's the Institute for Advanced Study. I used to, in my morning runs, go run by that almost every day, where Einstein was. I mean, like, physics at Princeton, like, I don't think it gets any better any place on the planet. So again, having read a lot of physics, I would say that for me, the best interpretation is Bohm's, the best we have so far. And Bohm puts forth what no one else has put forth, which is an ontological, this is why I'm wrapping around to physics and Bohm, an ontological interpretation of the quantum theory. And you notice right away that I'm not calling it quantum mechanics, because it's not really very mechanical. And Bohm, in his own writing, talks about why he refers to the quantum theory and not to quantum mechanics. And if anyone, or picks up any of my books or whatever, go to the end and look at my bibliographies and look at all the Bohm references that I have there, and try to read Bohm, because it's just really great. Now we're dealing with ontology, right? The nature.
I think you mentioned a 1990 paper of his that changed your that you really an article that you liked a lot. No, a paper that Bohm wrote in 1990. I forget the title of the paper, on how the matter and consciousness are part of the same spectrum, and how they are not different.
Yes. that 1990 paper, and I'm embarrassed. I put it in every single book I write because I read that. I've probably read that paper 30 times. So if you don't get it the first time, don't worry. Put it down. Go back in a few months. Try it again. Or it got to the point. It was so dense, that particular and so good, that particular paper, that I would like read a paragraph at a time and then like take a week to figure out that paragraph, and then I'd like go back and like read a different paragraph, not always in order, and then try to read the full paper again, and then finally, after multiple iterations over a period of years, actually, it started to sink in, that paper on the relationship between mind and matter. It starts with on the relationship, whatever. Okay, you'll put that paper, if you wouldn't mind. It would be great to put a link specifically to that PDF.
Yeah, yeah,
That paper is just so good, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, the premise of the paper is that mind and matter are inseparable, which is already a breakthrough. But he doesn't just posit things. He Bohm was linguistically brilliant, he was philosophically brilliant, and he was great with physics and math. And so he can argue it through the doorway of words and philosophy, but he also can argue it through the doorway of math and physics. And so some of his publications are more accessible if you don't have a strong math background. But I say to people, because I brought myself up through the math a little bit, even if you just look at the equation, Ramanujan, the Indian
Of course.
mathematician, and just also brilliant, complete. I'm like, I
Srinivasa
remember,
Ramanujan.
oh yeah, I have such respect for that man. Like I remember at Columbia asking, I was lucky, of course, I had students who would go get the books and bring them to me because like I had way to pay the students to do this. And so like I'm like, okay, go get all the original Ramanujan, just bring them over here, in his own handwriting kind of stuff. I
The
just stare at,
notebooks.
oh, the notebooks, there, you're familiar. And I would just stare at it, and I say the same thing with Bohm. Even if you consciously may not know what's going on, some of it's seeping in. So anyway, so we're back to this inseparability of mind and matter. And in other of his works, he develops that more mathematically, right? Now that particular paper is nice because it's mostly words, but there's some math, right? So it's a great way to start with Bohm.
Yeah, but
But
sorry
that's,
to
yeah, please go ahead.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you there again. Just so we don't lose our viewers, since we're talking about quantum theory and everything, which is already like really can be complicated for some people. I just want to make sure: is there a way to simplify really quickly for people who are listening? What is the difference between when you say Bohm's interpretation of quantum theory? So there is the standard Copenhagen model of quantum theory. In a way, if you could explain, in very simple terms, if it's possible, what is this and how is it different from the standard theory?
Okay, so the Copenhagen interpretation is very mechanical in orientation. And it's almost like, I'll make a very strange analogy. People know that aspirin works, right, for certain conditions, but they don't know the mechanism. They don't know why it works. So, sometimes it's just prescribed, take some aspirin, right, because it's going to work. You don't even actually know the interpretation. So the Copenhagen theory is a lot like that. It basically is able to provide a mathematical series of equations and an overall framework for that series of equations that sort of fits the data and can predictively fit the data, but there's no discussion of why. There's no discussion of why does this work? What are the implications of this math works for our discussion of the nature of reality? So Bohm wasn't content, you see. He was like, well, okay, it works and the math might work, but I'd like to know why. And so that's where he gets into his ontological interpretation, meaning he says what is it about the nature of reality that would be consistent with the math working?
Right.
So you see, because most physicists, they just brush that off. That's just like, well, it works. We're happy enough. Well, no, he wanted to go into the question more deep. And so the issue there is he develops this notion of implicate and explicate order, levels of order, and then above the implicate, super implicate, and I say above, and I should not use that, but it's hard in words to describe what he's getting at. So essentially he's saying there's explicate order, then there's this implicate order. And you see, the Copenhagen interpretation is just dealing with the explicate, what we can observe, what we
Right.
might predict, okay? But Bohm's saying, well, no, there's something else here. There's an implicate out of which the explicate arises and manifests. And then he goes more deeply, well, actually, there's a super implicate and a super implicate. And then he starts to realize that it's a series of levels of order, each one increasingly subtle as compared to the other. So I think this maps very well to the extraterrestrial acculturation. So, okay, and let's back up another step. Now, again, within the realm of physics, right, you have theories of gravity and cosmological theories, and you could say those are dealing with the macro, the big stuff, and the quantum is the little stuff. You know,
Right.
quantum level interactions are microscopic, right? And we know that this corrective is completely necessary in physics, a Bohmian-like corrective, because absent Bohm, quantum mechanics and general relativity are not unified, right? It's a broken paradigm. And he didn't like that, and he wanted to try to bring them together, right? And so he develops this, and he mathematically develops it. He doesn't just verbally posit it. This notion of series of levels of order, each one increasingly subtle. Now, this takes us right back around to, even if you want to stop? Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, when you say these different levels, in a physical sense, what does that mean? Are they like different levels of in which the reality is ordered, or would it be like different dimensions, or how
It's
would someone
not,
understand that?
it's not dimensions.
Okay.
Okay, and I think this is a much more productive way to look at things as opposed to this notion of dimensions, which is nobody can explain to you. And you want to throw out holographic universe, that doesn't do it, excuse me. And, Bohm himself gets into why the holographic thing is incomplete. So this is going past that notion. I think that, but to be a little nicer, okay, I think that it might seem like that. It might seem like a dimensional thing, right? Because it's a subtler thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense to me that experiencers might use that language of dimensionality because something is happening that is subtler often than what is happening in their regular lives of going to the grocery store. Now, the truth of the matter is, even when you go to the grocery store, all these subtle levels are operative. You're just not as aware of them. And it's more like a shift in awareness. It's more that what happens is, for whatever series of reasons or the context, or let's say the degree of proximity of, let's say, an extraterrestrial being, let's just say, that there is more of an awareness of those subtle levels that might be interpreted or voiced in terms of dimensionality. But so okay, well, what is it? So there's how it seems, there's how people describe it, but really, what is it,
Right.
right? So and it is different. How can I put it? I think a good way to look at this, and sometimes, ancient Vedic texts and Sanskrit really is quite ahead of its time, right? So there's the notion in Sanskrit, very basic, early Indian philosophical notion of namarupa, name and
Yeah.
form,
Yeah.
namarupa, right?
Yeah.
Rupa meaning things have a form, and nama, we give them a name and form, and name and form become very interlinked the more, as we grow up, right? If you're a infant and you don't have a verbal capacity yet, right? The perception tends to be maybe more diffuse because you're not busy naming everything that has been distinguished for you in terms of its form,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so this notion of rupa or form is really important here. And it gets to the question, which is now we're talking ontology, an ontological question. How is it that a form comes into existence? What is that process? Why is it that certain forms come into existence? Why is it that certain forms seem to reduplicate themselves and to proliferate, and other forms maybe come into existence and then dissipate and don't last very long? Like, what's going on there? So this whole conversation is a conversation around what's called morphogenesis, the genesis of morphology, the genesis of
Right.
form, right? And now that's ontology. The nature of reality, the genesis of form. Now, forms come into existence and we perceive them. Now, that's explicate order
Mm.
in Bohm's framework. But they arise out of implicate order. And so, at the implicate level, the form is there, but in a subtler way.
Mm.
It's almost meta. It's like the form of the form. Does that make sense? Like
S-
go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very interesting because I see how we slowly sort of it kind of we stray into a almost like a philosophical and spiritual kind of a territory where, especially coming from India and coming from a very Advaitic background of non-duality, personally, having read the Upanishads and everything, I recognize how it not entirely, but it comes into the territory of how there is a universal consciousness field, or the whatever you, I mean, it's called by different names,
It's not
and then
exactly that. Then don't go there, right?
okay,
Don't go to that's consciousness and this is matter. Because
okay,
the minute you go there, you lost the boat, right? Mind and matter, consciousness and matter they're inseparable. So, but if we don't call that thing consciousness or mind from what, right? Because that's like a core philosophical question through history of Indian texts, right?
yeah, yeah,
Is consciousness primary? Even
right,
you even see this spilling in. So right. So I'm with you on Advaita Vedanta, right? I know those arguments, right? And that spills over into Indo-Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, right? And Prasangika, like the mind-only school. Essentially, everything can be reduced to a substrate of mind. But I'm not saying that. Bohm's not saying that. Bohm's not saying that, and I'm following. Bohm not saying that. The thing here is different. It's a interpenetrative mind matter. But it's subtler than that. I think the rupa, the form thing, it's the subtle thing from which the explicate form arises. It's like this Bohm puts it this way. It's an ordering principle. It's a
Mm.
principle of order. And he develops that. I mean, this is a really long conversation, it is a tough conversation to have if you haven't read the Bohm first. It's probably better we just almost bracket it. But the point is that okay, so now I'm going to make a sort of abrupt right-hand turn into the UAP topic.
Yeah, yeah. Because I was going
And
to come to that because we set the stage explaining Bohm's point of view, but then I was going to say, how does this fit into the UAP discourse?
right, and it's easy to make that turn right here in the conversation. Okay? So essentially, this is the argument that I made. Any extraterrestrial species that is here does not operate on the basis of a broken physics, because you can't get here from there given the constraints of gravity unless you understand gravity, and gravity and quantum have already been unified and you have a complete working physics paradigm. The minute you have a complete working physics paradigm, gravity is no longer constrained. And you can get here because now here it gets interesting. Well, how might one get here? Either you could say through some sort of anti-gravity, propulsion sort of situation. Maybe
Hmm.
if you were close enough, you'd do it that way. Maybe through something like a wormhole, maybe. And then I go way speculative, saying if you really understand morphogenesis, if you really get it, if your culture already is that far ahead that you understand this ability to move from implicate to explicate, where you might just be able to manifest in the explicate wherever
Right.
you frankly wanted to, however you might want to.
Right. I think if I understand correctly, I think I'm really understanding what you're saying. So basically, instead of thinking of space as real and then physically moving from here to here, having to solve that problem, they sort of dissolve and reorganize instantaneously in another place.
It's a little Star Trekky like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
little. Yeah, if you really get it, then you get it. And why wouldn't you be able to operation? So I use this term. Why wouldn't you be able to operationalize that movement across the threshold from implicate to explicate? I'm sure you could. So that's a whole nother level of how, which might look to some people like spooky, paranormal. It's not really paranormal in the least. It's just a much better understanding of the normal, right?
Right.
It's an understanding to the level of the ability to operationalize that movement, right?
Right.
Now we have to get back, right? So now form, the notion of form. Okay, so what's happening here are a couple of things have collapsed. One thing, and you completely bingo, one thing that collapsed is the notion of here and there. Distance collapsed. So space has collapsed. And we have a different thing. But time has collapsed too. Because the minute space collapses, I mean time collapses, space-time is the same. So now space and time have collapsed. And Bohm talks about this too, how past, present, future, the linear notion of time is again an epiphenomenon of our perception, that really time is one. So now if space-time has collapsed, right? Now we're here. We're not really having to go from here to there, or you see past it becomes
Yeah.
much more immediate. Now this is where things become, it's very immediate. Like there's the now. And that means that what's happening in the now is critically important across space-time, because space-time's collapsed, so there's no more across. So now form really matters. Now we get to the nuclear thing. right?
Mm.
So a fission explosion, just the form of it, the manifestation of a nuclear fission explosion is, I mean, what are the words? So destructive. It's destructive. So now you can see why any intelligent species would be concerned about that, because it's a form of destruction that's now in the fabric of
Mm.
the whole. So it is immediately of impact to that species. Immediately.
Right.
And there's another thing here, which is, it's not exactly the right word, but I'm going to use it. It's the codification. It's not precisely, but let me hang with that word for a second. It's the propagation. So Bohm explains, and this is so important, this going between implicate and explicate. Once a form is in the implicate, it's more likely to propagate back out. So once you have one explosion,
Right.
you're more likely to have 10 or 100 or whatever, just because of how that movement, just because of the nature of that relationship between implicate and explicate. And he unpacks that in considerable detail.
Right.
So it's like any form you put in there, if it's intensely destructive, it's impacting the whole right immediately, and it has the negative potentiality to immediately start reproducing itself and then like ripping through the whole with this destructive force, right? So
Almost like a chain reaction of its own,
yeah,
in a
almost
way.
like something stupid going viral on the internet. Like, I shouldn't, maybe stupid's too strong a word, but, it's interesting. Like, you see these certain TikTok videos of whatever, like, I don't know,
Yeah,
hamster
they
running
call
down
them
a wheel.
they call
And
them low effort content.
yeah. And you see, like, something totally trivial, hamster running on a wheel and looking cute, 25 million views.
Yeah.
No, we'll get 10 views of our video. And you're like, what? Like, and so like that, because it more people, why it's easy, whatever. And then, it explains this incredible degradation of human culture into this narcissistic abyss of, like, selfies. And so, you have to be careful what form you're putting out there, because it, could be picked up. And sometimes the more superficial and unhelpful things are, the more quickly they're picked up. And then they propagate through. So you've got this like culture, humankind, like running totally, completely amok, doing ridiculous things with no empathy, with really powerful weapon systems. Yeah,
Right.
I'd be concerned too.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah. Yeah. So this so this is actually kind of making it clear. Like, I was wondering how Bohm's interpretation and UAPs were connected, but this makes a lot of sense. So that's a very interesting viewpoint. I don't think I've heard anybody express it in this way, before, when talking about UFOs. I also wanted to ask you about some of the associated phenomena when people talk of UFOs. I don't know if it's been the focus of your study or not, which is when people talk about UFOs, they also talk about alien abductions, contactees, crop circles, and cattle mutilation and stuff like that. But we are basically not looking at them as.
I'll tell you two things that I'll discuss two things I find very interesting: megaliths and crop circles.
Hmm.
So I think the more I study about megaliths, the more it becomes just completely clear that there was a global culture it was inordinately sophisticated. It might, at least go back to the conventional timeline that people are associating with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is like, whatever, 12,000 years ago, whatever. But it could be, you can't really date the megalithic sites. The dating is, things that might be found in conjunction with the sites that are dateable, but the stone itself is really not dateable in the same way, especially like dating the holes where they're putting the stones. Well, is that perfect? Well, what if the stone had fallen down and then they replanted the stone? Whatever. The point I'm trying to make is the megalithic culture might go back much farther, much, much farther than we think. And there's been some interesting work that's been done on modular geometry, mathematics associated with megalithic sites, for example, in Karnak. So looking at the long rows, and it's not merely that these sites are astronomical, have many series of interrelated complex astronomical alignments, but also that over vast distances there are geometrical relationships between sites that are encoded in the sites themselves. And so I think that is an incredibly productive area of research. If I had independent funding, I would be working on that, pretty much as full-time megaliths and ancient sites using high-tech methodology, and serving whatever space-based LiDAR, whatever it is. I would be just throwing it at that, trying to make a real map and then trying to figure out the geometry. Now, I also think crop circles are intensely interesting. And it's interesting. I don't normally talk personal stuff or anecdotes, but I'll take a bit of an exception here. So, way back, I don't know what year, it was in the 90s. So I decided I wanted to write a screenplay, right? And so as one of my themes in the screenplay, I was going to have this idea that the crops, and I hadn't seen them. I mean, I'd seen them, but I hadn't been to them. That the crop circles were like a government, psyop, testing. Like this was a theme in my screenplay that I wanted to write.
Right.
So I thought to myself, I should go there, see them. Am I right or am I not right? So I went there with this kind of cynical, skeptical idea in my head. So I'm only mentioning that because I was not predisposed for the experience that I had. And when I got there, firstly, I'm a civil engineer, right? So, I have a little bit of a sense of how difficult or not it is to build things, especially things that are on like surfaces. We used to have to like design highway systems out in Princeton. I have a bit of a sense of this, and I have a bit of a sense of, what tools you have available. Immediately, I could tell the fakes from the authentic. I mean, it was simple, right? If you have any engineering background at all, you can tell the fakes right away. There weren't that many fakes, but there were enough fakes, right? Fakes meaning humans clearly made them.
Human made, yeah.
Absolutely. And then there were others that made no sense whatsoever. And there were visual ways that you could see that this made no sense. But for me, it was even more pronounced. So when I would enter into an authentic, now we'll put to the side what does authentic mean, right? But when I would enter an authentic crop circle, immediately I'd feel sick. Like my migraine level, like I had to sit down in the crop. I couldn't stay in the real ones for very long. And like splitting head. Then I would go out and I'd be fine. And if I entered, and all of this is happening before I'm figuring out what's happening. I mean, I didn't have an idea that, if anything, right, I would maybe tend to think, well, the authentic ones are going to make me feel good. But oh no, I mean, I was just down for the count, splitting head, sick to my stomach, and it's immediate as I went back and forth over the threshold, right? And then the human-made ones, there's just nothing. You feel absolutely nothing. So I had an internal barometer, but you didn't even need I mean, you just do it visually. In the authentic ones, the grain is braided. It's like overlapping like this. Nothing that exerts no kind of plane or wood or anything that is it's going to squash it all in the same direction. The stalks are going to break where at the point, right? That's what's going to happen. No, at the point of turning, at the base of that point, then it's intact, right? And you see expulsion nodes, like you see like heat or something cause something to explode, but then throughout and these some of them are enormous, right? Over like football field size, and yet all of the stalks are rated. It's impossible.
And
I mean,
the pattern itself was like intricately geometric. Did it have any meaning? What, like, there are
from
different kinds.
a bird's eye view, the
Yeah,
patterns, right?
yeah,
So, and that's a whole other level of it, right? So, you have a lot of fractal-based things. Mandelbrot set, Julia set have been reproduced. And then there have been others that sort of present themselves sort of without pretension. But then you'll have people decoding the geometry, and the geometry, if you look at it in a three-dimensional sense, is really complicated. So, yeah. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. I just know that it's not anything people are doing on the weekend or
yeah,
overnight. And
yeah.
and there's some mechanism. I don't know. I don't even want to speculate. Yeah, on what the mechanism is. But it is interesting that the geometry can be incredibly complex. And I do think it would be certainly worth someone's while. I used to think that would be something I might want to do is, get all of those geometric patterns into some system and start to figure that out. Like, is there a signature to the communication? But I think those two things are very, very worthwhile. I think for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure. My intuition right now, although I would love to, be in the UK right now looking at crop circles, that would be just so fun. But I think that theoretically, I think there's just so much with the megaliths that if you could unpack the math there, you really have a much better understanding of history and potentially, any kind of extraterrestrial knowledge that has somehow found its way to Earth.
Have you heard about the what are they called, ley lines, the energetic grid that's supposed to go around Earth, and how in the UK especially some of these megalithic structures are organized on these energy lines, like if you draw from point to point. I think they call them ley lines or ley lines. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's part and parcel of the megalithic discovery. You know, certainly, certainly there is a linear relationship between many of the sites because many of the sites form complex geometry and geometry, anything that's certainly based on triangles, it's going to be linear, right?
Yeah,
Parts of it are
yeah,
going to be linear.
yeah.
So yeah, and again, some of that has some people are starting to decode the math over distances. So yeah, I think that's another interesting arena.
Right. Right. Now, I thought I would go into some of your work that you do with Sanskrit and so on, but then I'm afraid we've already spent so much time, and I think that would be like another entire podcast on its own. So I won't go there now. But
Okay.
but I do want to quickly, as we come to the close of the podcast for today, I wanted to get your explanation on what you mean. Well, two things actually. One, what do you mean by hyperconflation, which is the title of one of your books?
Right. So what I mean there is, well, first of all, what is conflation, right? Conflation is where you say X is Y when X is really not Y, but you're saying like extraterrestrials are demons, There's a conflation for you. There was one. That kind of stuff distracts me. Like, oh my God. But that's a very popular thing that one hears said by, let's say, certain evangelical religious people. They're not extra, they're demons. So that's a kind of a conflation. And then you can have conflations that pile up on top of one another. And that's what I mean by hyperconflation, is these things are starting, one conflation piles up on top of another conflation, piles up and intersects with another one, and pretty soon you just have a real mess on your hands. That's what I was trying to say. And the notion of hyperconvergence is the same thing too. It's like when religion converges with politics. Now that's messy already. And now we have to get that converging with the national security state on top of it. And it's just like one convergence upon another. And pretty much everybody's rendered like, I don't know, it's like very stultifying. It doesn't go anywhere. There's no, it's like human beings have a really incredible way of locking themselves into their own boxes. They're like conflating this and, converging this. And then all of a sudden they're just looking at each other and they haven't gone anywhere in the conversation. That's what
Yeah.
I'm.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think it's a good point to close on this point is that, like, when I look at humanity and human civilizations, there is so much of cultural and ethno-linguistic differences amongst ourselves that we are hardly able to understand each other, across the pond, across different cultures and different continents, and even to understand cultures back in time, for example. And we have very poor communication with non-human intelligence which are terrestrial. Like, we don't know how to deal with intelligent animals like whales and dolphins, or maybe even communicate with trees and nature, which are so innately, which have this conscious intelligence, which anybody, I'm sure people would agree now. So what hope do we have to actually communicate with extraterrestrial non-human intelligence? What is your concluding? Are you hopeful, or is there some kind of, I think you mentioned this in some of, maybe I don't remember which paper or article, it's almost like a pedagogical approach they're taking, almost like a
Yeah.
benevolent teacher kind of an approach.
I think it's very much that. And I think so. It's completely hopeful. I mean, I the one thing about the interaction that I think a lot of people are unaware. If you're coming to this fresh and you don't really know that much about it, but I think people think it's very impersonal. But I don't think it's like that at all. And I think it's very fine tuned, meaning, the extent to which you make it clear that you're open to the interaction is the extent to which you will be interacted with. If your motivation is authentic and genuine, meaning you're not trying to make money, not trying to take over the world, you're not trying to develop the, latest, greatest Wunderwaffe, you're not trying to make a weapon system out of it. You're just trying to make the whole better. And then I think there was an article, and I had it at one point. It was published in one of those early, UFO kind of journals or newsletters even. And it was written by Michael Swartz, Swords, and he was a professor. He's professor emeritus at a university in Michigan. I forgot, maybe Western Michigan, I've forgotten. But he wrote an article, and he's actually was a very good researcher. He wrote an article that was based on, I guess, self-reports of 3 physicists. And essentially, the article explained how, or 3 scientists of some type, but I think they were somehow physicists associated with nuclear paradigm, that essentially they had a group sighting, and there were elements of the group sighting that were so incredibly specific to the three of them and to where they were. Like literally, that UAP had to be exactly there at exactly that moment to have exactly that, impact on those three scientists. It was so fine tuned. And so sometimes I think people ask this question, well, like, why wasn't everybody? Well, everybody's not ready. Everybody's not ready. I heard one of the UFO personalities sort of screaming on a television documentary, we're ready. No, everybody's not ready. And all you need to understand that is go to YouTube and see these people saying extraterrestrials are demons, and then do the math of how many people in the United States own guns and how they might freak out. And you realize this is really a delicate operation. And so a fine-tuned approach would make a lot of sense from the extraterrestrial point of view as the correct acculturation, technique to use.
So at this point, you're pretty sure that they are the ones in control of disclosure, so to speak.
I wouldn't put it that bluntly, not because I'm objecting to your bluntness, because I'm not. I think that the notion of control is not quite right. I think that they're not trying to control anything. I think they are trying to do their best in the moment. And we need to try to do our best in the moment. And if everybody would just do that, a lot of things would get better. Interpersonal relationships, geopolitical relationships, a whole bunch of things could get better. Just on one thing. And I think that's what's happening there. They're not controlling anything. They're just doing their best with a very complex series of circumstances.
Right. Well, on that hopeful note, I think we should just wrap up today's podcast. And I really enjoyed the fresh perspectives that you brought to this topic, and I'm really hoping at some point in the future we can do another one if you're free on your Sanskrit work, and I'd be super curious as to what you do, and I know you mentioned it somehow relates to UFO as well, so in that sense, so yeah, I'd be totally up for another podcast at some point. So Dr. Jensine Andresen, thank you so much for joining us today, and it was a wonderful chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very kindly for the invitation. It was really nice to meet you.